I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted, and when their lawyer read the final sentence of my will, he stopped mid-breath and stared at them as if he had just seen the future collapse. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the brass clock mounted on Harold Green's office wall, a sound that suddenly seemed louder than it had any right to be. And I remember noticing how confident Daniel looked sitting there in his tailored navy suit, legs crossed, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, as if the next hour of his life had already been calculated and approved, while Vanessa sat beside him with a leather portfolio balanced neatly on her lap, her posture straight, her lips pressed into that careful expression she wore whenever she believed she was about to secure something valuable. I had chosen the seat across from them deliberately, not beside them, not at the head of the long walnut conference table, but directly opposite, where I could see both their faces without turning my head, where I could study the subtle shifts in their eyes, the flicker of anticipation, the faint impatience disguised as sympathy. And if you had walked in at that moment, you would have thought this was simply a grieving family finalizing paperwork after a difficult year, a mother, her son, her daughter-in-law, and a trusted attorney preparing to honor a lifetime of work built over 4 decades in this country. What you would not have seen was how carefully this morning had been constructed, how each signature placed over the past 72 hours had been guided not by surrender, but by precision, how every quiet nod I had given Daniel when he suggested simplifying the estate, every measured pause when Vanessa spoke about what's practical at this stage, had been part of something much larger than they could imagine. After my husband Edward passed last spring, the house felt different, not emptier exactly, but observed, as if decisions were being made in whispers just beyond closed doors. And I began to notice how often the word inheritance appeared in ordinary conversation, how casually Daniel asked whether I had considered downsizing our 4,200-square-foot home in Westchester, how Vanessa mentioned the rising property taxes with a tone that suggested she had already priced the square footage in her mind. And I listened, I nodded, I let them believe their concerns were wise and timely, because there is a particular kind of strength in allowing people to underestimate you. Harold adjusted his glasses that morning as he reached the final page, and I watched his expression change almost imperceptibly as he realized what the clause actually meant. The subtle tightening around his eyes, the slight hesitation before he cleared his throat. And Daniel leaned forward just a fraction, eager, while Vanessa's fingers curled slightly around the edge of her portfolio. And in that suspended second before the words were spoken, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally stop hoping people will prove you wrong and instead accept exactly who they have shown themselves to be. I had not argued when Daniel suggested restructuring the assets. I had not protested when Vanessa proposed consolidating accounts. I had not even reacted when they discussed future renovations to a property that technically still belonged to me, because sometimes the most effective response is silence. And silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, but strategy. Harold began to read, his voice steady at first, moving through standard language about distributions, timelines, and fiduciary responsibilities, and Daniel exhaled slowly, as though confirming a private expectation, and Vanessa's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. But then Harold reached the final paragraph, and his cadence shifted, and he stopped just long enough to ensure every word would land exactly where it was meant to. And in that pause, I folded my hands neatly in my lap and waited, because this was the moment I had prepared for, the moment they had assumed would secure their future, and instead it would redefine it. And as Harold looked up from the page, meeting Daniel's eyes before speaking, I realized something simple and undeniable. They had asked for everything, and I had given it to them, exactly as promised. The silence in Harold Green's office did not begin that morning. It began 3 days earlier, at my kitchen table, when the sunlight came through the tall windows and stretched across the granite countertops Edward and I had chosen together 20 years ago. And I sat there with a cup of black coffee growing cold in my hands, while Daniel stood near the refrigerator, explaining in a voice that tried to sound gentle that a house of this size was simply too much for one woman in her 70s to manage alone. He spoke about maintenance costs, about property taxes that had climbed above $20,000 a year, about the practicality of moving into a smaller condominium closer to town, and Vanessa nodded beside him as though each word had been carefully rehearsed the night before. I remember watching the way Daniel avoided looking directly at the framed photograph of his father on the wall, how he kept his gaze fixed instead on the spreadsheet open on his tablet, as if numbers were easier to face than memory. And I realized then that the conversation was not about my comfort or my safety, but about acceleration, about timing, about bringing the future forward to suit their plans.
Vanessa mentioned that real estate values in Westchester were strong, that the 4,200 square feet of this property could yield a substantial return if sold before the next fiscal year, and she said it with a calm efficiency that might have impressed me if I had not recognized the underlying assumption that the decision had already been made. I did not argue. I did not remind them that Edward and I had paid off the mortgage 15 years early, or that every inch of that home represented decades of careful budgeting and long work weeks. Instead, I asked a simple question about closing timelines, and Daniel's shoulders eased as though he believed I had accepted the logic. Later that afternoon, Vanessa returned alone with brochures from a retirement community 40 miles north, describing the landscaped walking paths, the fitness center, the organized activities, and she placed the glossy pamphlet in front of me with a sympathetic smile that felt too polished to be spontaneous. She spoke about community, about convenience, about how much easier life would be without stairs, and I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, allowing her to believe that the decision was ripening in my mind exactly as she intended. What they did not see was the shift that had already taken place inside me, the quiet recalibration that occurs when you recognize that kindness is being interpreted as compliance. That evening, after they left, I walked slowly through the house, touching the back of the dining chairs Edward had refinished himself, running my fingers along the banister he had installed with such pride, and I understood that this was not simply about property, but about narrative, about who would control the story of what happened next. The following morning, I called Harold Green and asked for a private appointment, not to defend myself, not to accuse anyone, but to clarify a question that had begun to form with surprising precision. What protections exist for a woman who senses she is being gently ushered toward the exit of her own life? Harold listened without interruption, and when I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and said that estate planning was not only about distribution, but about conditions, about defining the circumstances under which assets move from one generation to the next. And in that moment, the path forward became clear. I did not need confrontation. I needed structure. Over the next 2 days, I signed documents Daniel believed were procedural, initialed pages Vanessa assumed were confirmations of transition, and I thanked them both for their concern in a tone so steady that neither questioned its authenticity, because sometimes the most effective preparation is invisible, and sometimes the quietest signature carries the most weight. By the time we returned to Harold Green's office for the formal reading, Daniel had already spoken with 2 real estate agents and scheduled a preliminary valuation of the house, something he mentioned casually over lunch the day before as though it were simply responsible planning, and Vanessa had begun referring to the retirement community as if it were a confirmed arrangement rather than a suggestion, describing available floor plans and exact square footage, and explaining how quickly units tended to sell out in the spring. I listened carefully, asking neutral questions about timelines and moving companies, and each time I responded without resistance, I saw their confidence grow. It was subtle at first, a slight relaxation in Daniel's posture, a faint brightness in Vanessa's tone, but by the morning of the reading, it had transformed into certainty. Daniel even placed a reassuring hand over mine in the waiting area, telling me that everything was going to work out smoothly, and that change, while difficult, was often necessary at this stage of life. I looked at his hand resting over mine and thought about the boy who used to grip my fingers tightly when crossing busy streets in Manhattan, and I wondered when that instinct to protect had quietly reversed itself into something else, something that felt less like care and more like management. Harold began the session with standard formalities, reviewing dates, confirming identities, and explaining that the updated estate documents reflected my most recent decisions. Daniel nodded as though he had expected nothing less, and Vanessa opened her portfolio, prepared to take notes. The early sections were ordinary enough, outlining distributions of personal effects, charitable donations, and financial accounts, all structured in a way that appeared straightforward and predictable.
Daniel exhaled slowly when Harold confirmed that he remained the primary beneficiary under normal circumstances, and Vanessa's pen moved steadily across the page as though she were already allocating future renovations in her mind. I kept my expression calm, allowing the rhythm of the reading to reinforce their assumptions. What they did not understand was that the most important element of any contract is not the beginning, but the condition under which it changes. Harold reached the final section and adjusted his glasses again, this time more deliberately, and I noticed a faint crease forming between his brows as he reread the language silently before speaking. He cleared his throat and read the clause that specified the estate would remain intact and pass as outlined, provided that I retained full residence in my primary home without coercion, pressure, or relocation efforts initiated by any beneficiary, and that any documented attempt to compel my transfer to another property prior to my voluntary decision would trigger an immediate and irrevocable reallocation of all major assets into a protected charitable trust. The air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel's pen stopped moving. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Harold continued, clarifying that written proposals, signed preliminary agreements, or external consultations regarding the sale of the primary residence without my express initiation constituted evidence of such efforts. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel looked at Vanessa, confusion replacing certainty, and then both of them turned toward me as though searching for a signal that this was some misunderstanding. I met their eyes steadily and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had done countless times at this table, and in that stillness, I understood something that had taken me 72 years to learn. Sometimes the only way to preserve dignity is to define the boundaries yourself, in writing, in ink that does not waver, and to let others discover those boundaries only after they have stepped too close. Daniel was the first to speak, but his voice did not carry the confidence it had held only minutes earlier. Instead, it sounded measured, cautious, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground and testing each word before letting it settle in the air. He asked Harold to clarify the definition of coercion, and Harold, steady and professional, repeated the language exactly as it appeared in the document, emphasizing that any documented effort to initiate my relocation without my direct request would activate the protective clause immediately. Vanessa's eyes shifted toward me then, searching for some indication that I would intervene, that I would soften the edges of what had just been read. But I remained still, because there was nothing left to negotiate. I had not accused them. I had not raised my voice. I had simply drawn a line. Daniel leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen countless times during his college years when he was faced with an unexpected exam question, and I recognized the same calculation returning to his expression now, the quiet attempt to reassess the situation and locate a path forward. Vanessa closed her portfolio slowly, as though the motion itself required careful control, and she asked whether preliminary consultations with real estate agents would fall under the category Harold had described. Harold answered that any written correspondence or scheduled valuation conducted without my request would be considered evidence.
The words settled between us with a weight that did not require repetition. I could almost see the timeline rewinding in their minds, the emails sent, the phone calls placed, the appointments penciled into calendars under the assumption that my consent would follow automatically. For a brief moment, Daniel looked younger to me, not because of vulnerability, but because of realization, as if he were confronting a lesson he had hoped never to revisit. The understanding that actions carry consequences, even when intentions are disguised as practicality. I spoke only once, calmly, to confirm that my primary goal was stability, that I had no immediate plans to relocate, and that I valued clarity above assumption. My voice did not tremble. I did not mention the brochures Vanessa had left on my dining table, or the spreadsheet Daniel had shared outlining projected proceeds from the sale of the house. I did not need to. The structure of the document had already done that work for me. As we gathered our things, Harold offered a courteous reminder that the clause was not punitive but protective, designed to ensure that any major life transition originated from my own decision rather than external pressure. Daniel nodded, though his expression remained distant, and Vanessa managed a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. When we stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the afternoon air felt cooler than it had earlier, and for a moment none of us spoke. The city moved around us with ordinary rhythm, cars passing, pedestrians hurrying past with coffee cups in hand, unaware that the direction of our family had just shifted in a quiet conference room.
Daniel finally cleared his throat and suggested that we discuss everything over dinner later in the week. But the tone of invitation had changed. It no longer carried certainty, only caution.
I thanked him and said that I would consider it, then walked toward my car at a pace that felt deliberate and unhurried. As I settled into the driver's seat and closed the door, I allowed myself a single measured breath, not of triumph, but of confirmation, because dignity does not require applause, and protection does not require explanation. It requires only the willingness to define your own boundaries and to stand behind them without apology. The house felt different when I returned that afternoon, not because anything had physically changed, but because the assumptions attached to it had shifted. And as I set my handbag on the entryway table and removed my gloves with slow, deliberate movements, I understood that what had happened in Harold's office would not dissolve quietly. Daniel called that evening, his tone carefully measured, asking whether we could revisit the conversation about long-term planning, and I heard in his voice the strain of someone recalculating a strategy that no longer guaranteed the outcome he had expected. I told him that I appreciated his concern and that I had already planned my long-term arrangements with thoughtful care, and I allowed a gentle pause to follow, not long enough to sound confrontational, but long enough to signal that the topic was no longer open for persuasion. 2 days later, he arrived at the house alone, without Vanessa, which in itself told me more than his words ever could, and he walked through the foyer slowly, as though reacquainting himself with the space, his gaze lingering on the staircase, the high ceilings, the crown molding his father had insisted upon during renovations. He spoke about memories then, about holidays and birthdays, about how much work it must be to maintain 4,200 square feet, and I listened without interrupting, because I knew that beneath the nostalgia was an attempt to soften the previous week's implications. He suggested that perhaps we could draft a separate understanding, something informal, something that clarified intentions so there would be no misunderstanding in the future. And I realized that what he truly wanted was reassurance, that the protective clause could be neutralized without appearing to challenge it directly. I poured us both coffee and handed him the mug his father used for years, the one with the small chip near the handle. And I said calmly that there was no misunderstanding, that the document reflected exactly what I intended, and that I valued peace within the family more than any financial arrangement. His jaw tightened slightly at that, not in anger, but in recognition, and for the first time since Edward's passing, I saw uncertainty replace confidence in his expression. Later that week, Vanessa invited me to lunch at a restaurant near their home, a place known for its polished wood interiors and quiet atmosphere, and she spoke about respect and harmony, about how legal language can sometimes create unintended distance between loved ones. I responded that clarity prevents distance far more effectively than assumption, and I watched her expression shift from persuasion to calculation, as though she were reassessing which approach might yield better results. The brochures from the retirement community disappeared from my dining table. The real estate agent's business card was no longer visible on the kitchen counter where Daniel had left it days earlier. Conversations became careful, each word weighed, each suggestion framed as optional rather than inevitable. I did not celebrate this change. I simply observed it. Because what they had misunderstood was not the value of the house or the accounts or the investments built over 40 years, but the value of autonomy. I had not constructed the clause to punish them. I had constructed it to remind them that I was not an asset to be transitioned, not a line item to be relocated for efficiency.
And as the days passed and the urgency in their voices softened into something more restrained, I recognized a quiet truth that required no announcement. Sometimes the greatest inheritance you protect is not measured in dollars or square footage, but in the right to remain exactly where you choose to stand. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted in the air between us, not dramatic enough to be called reconciliation, and not tense enough to be called conflict, but measured, careful, as though every interaction now passed through an invisible filter before reaching the surface. Daniel stopped mentioning market values and renovation plans. Vanessa no longer brought up lifestyle communities or convenience. Instead, they asked neutral questions about my health, about whether the lawn service was reliable, about whether the upstairs guest room felt drafty in the evenings. Their concerns sounded polished, practiced, but no longer directive. I answered calmly, offering information without invitation, and I noticed how often Daniel studied my tone, as if searching for weakness or willingness, some indication that time might undo what ink had secured. One Sunday afternoon they came for dinner, arriving with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of white lilies that Vanessa placed carefully on the dining table, and we spoke about ordinary things, about business developments at Daniel's firm, about a neighbor who had recently sold her home for just under $1.8 million, about traffic along the parkway. The conversation remained smooth, but underneath it ran a quiet current of awareness. Every mention of property now carried weight. Every reference to the future felt measured.
At one point, Daniel offered to review my monthly statements to ensure everything remained organized, and I thanked him but explained that Harold and I had already streamlined the reporting process. He nodded, hiding his disappointment behind a courteous smile, and for the first time I realized that what unsettled him most was not the clause itself, but the realization that he was no longer steering the timeline. Later that evening, as I cleared the plates from the table, Vanessa followed me into the kitchen and stood beside the sink, her voice lower than usual, and she said she hoped I understood that their suggestions had always come from a place of care. I rinsed the dishes slowly, feeling the warm water run over my hands, and replied that care does not require urgency, and that patience is often the truest sign of respect. She did not argue. She simply absorbed the statement and stepped back. When they left, Daniel hugged me longer than he had in months, his embrace firm but uncertain, as though he were adjusting to a dynamic he had not anticipated. After the door closed and the house returned to its familiar stillness, I walked through each room deliberately, not out of nostalgia, but out of affirmation. The staircase still held steady beneath my feet. The living room windows still framed the trees exactly as they had when Edward first admired the view. Nothing had been lost. Nothing had been surrendered. What had changed was alignment. They no longer viewed the house as a near-term acquisition. They viewed it as conditional. And that distinction altered everything. Over time, conversations grew lighter, less strategic, and I sensed that Daniel was learning something he had not expected to learn in his 40s, that inheritance is not a transaction waiting to be triggered, but a privilege dependent on trust.
I did not remind him of the clause again. I did not threaten, did not warn. The document rested quietly in Harold's files, precise and enforceable, requiring no defense. And as the days lengthened into early summer, I recognized that the greatest shift had not occurred in their expectations, but in my own understanding. I no longer felt managed. I felt anchored. Because once you define the conditions under which your life proceeds, you do not need to argue your position. You simply live within it and let others adjust accordingly. Autumn arrived quietly that year, and with it came a different rhythm to our interactions, less cautious but not entirely restored, as though we were all aware that something fundamental had shifted and could not simply be undone. Daniel began visiting more frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes with Vanessa, and the conversations gradually drifted away from property and finances toward ordinary subjects again. Yet I could sense that each visit carried an unspoken evaluation. He would glance at the gutters after a storm, ask whether the furnace had been serviced before winter, comment on the driveway needing resealing before the first frost. The observations were practical, but I recognized the underlying habit of assessment, the instinct to measure stability against opportunity. I answered each remark with calm assurance, explaining that I had scheduled maintenance months in advance, that I had reviewed insurance coverage with Harold, that the house remained fully under control. The more prepared I appeared, the less room there was for suggestion.
One afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly while I was pruning the rose bushes along the side yard, and he stepped out of his car looking momentarily surprised to see me handling the shears myself. He offered to take over, and I handed him the gloves without hesitation, watching him adjust to the physical task in a way that reminded me of his teenage years, when responsibility was something he practiced rather than assumed. We worked side by side in silence for several minutes, trimming back branches that had grown wild over the summer, and I sensed that the simplicity of the moment unsettled him more than any legal document had. Without the structure of an agenda, there was nothing to negotiate. Eventually, he asked whether I felt secure living alone, and I replied that security comes not from proximity to others, but from clarity about one's own decisions. He did not challenge the statement. Instead, he nodded slowly,
as if absorbing its meaning for the first time. Later that evening, as we sat on the back patio with cups of tea, he admitted that he had assumed transitions would be easier if managed early, that waiting felt inefficient. I listened without judgment and told him that life is not an investment portfolio to be optimized on a schedule, and that sometimes delay is not loss but preservation. The words lingered between us in the cool air, and for a brief moment I saw the tension ease from his posture, replaced by something closer to reflection. Vanessa's demeanor changed as well in the following weeks. She no longer framed conversations around future plans, but asked instead about family history, about stories from when Edward and I first purchased the property for $800,000 decades ago, about how we had built equity steadily rather than rapidly. I answered with details, not to impress, but to remind them that what stands today was not assembled overnight and would not be dismantled casually. As Thanksgiving approached, Daniel invited me to host dinner at the house as we had for years, and I agreed, recognizing that continuity itself can be a powerful statement. When they arrived with dishes and wine, there was no mention of valuations or timelines, only shared preparation and ordinary conversation. The clause remained where it belonged, in the background, steady and silent. It did not need to dominate our interactions to be effective. Its existence had already recalibrated expectations. And as I watched Daniel carve the turkey at the same dining table where Edward once stood, I understood that influence does not require confrontation. Sometimes it requires patience, a firm boundary, and the willingness to let others grow into the understanding that respect cannot be rushed and inheritance cannot be demanded ahead of its time. Winter settled in with a steady patience that matched the new balance within our family, and by December the house felt less like contested territory and more like what it had always been, a place anchored by routine and memory rather than speculation. Snow gathered along the edges of the driveway in soft white layers, and I arranged for the plow service before the first storm without mentioning it to Daniel, not out of secrecy, but out of independence. He noticed, of course. When he stopped by one Saturday morning after a heavy snowfall, he glanced at the cleared path and nodded approvingly, as though silently acknowledging that I had anticipated what needed to be done without prompting. There was no comment about whether I should consider relocating before next winter. Instead, he asked if I needed anything from the hardware store, and I thanked him but said I had already ordered fresh salt for the walkway. The conversation remained ordinary, yet beneath it ran a deeper understanding that the future would unfold on its proper timeline, not on an accelerated schedule shaped by anxiety. Vanessa's tone softened as well. She began calling in the evenings simply to ask how I was feeling, sometimes sharing stories about her own work frustrations or neighborhood updates. The careful calculation that once colored her suggestions seemed replaced by a cautious respect. I did not mistake this for transformation. People do not change overnight, but they do adapt when boundaries are clear. In early January, Daniel invited me to attend a financial planning seminar his firm was hosting, explaining that he thought I might enjoy the presentation on long-term security. I accepted, not because I needed guidance, but because participation signals strength more effectively than refusal. As I sat in the conference room listening to discussions about asset preservation and responsible succession, I felt a quiet satisfaction that my own planning had already secured what truly mattered. When Daniel introduced me to colleagues as his mother, there was a new steadiness in his voice, not pride attached to eventual inheritance, but recognition of the foundation that had made his career possible. Later that evening, as we drove back through the city lights, he spoke about legacy in broader terms, about mentorship and values, about building something that outlasts profit margins. I listened carefully, recognizing that this was the lesson I had hoped would take root, that inheritance is not a guarantee, but a reflection of trust maintained over time. Back at the house, I brewed tea and watched the steam rise gently into the kitchen air, thinking about how different the atmosphere felt from the afternoon when brochures had been placed on the same counter. Nothing in the structure had changed. The same walls stood, the same staircase curved toward the upper floor, but the energy had shifted, from anticipation to acknowledgement. The protective clause remained in place, quiet and unthreatening, yet powerful in its clarity. It no longer needed to be referenced. Its existence had already reshaped behavior. And as I looked out the window at the snow illuminated by the porch light, I understood that sometimes the most effective safeguard is not confrontation, but design, not volume, but precision. When you establish the terms of your own life with calm certainty, others may resist at first, but eventually they adjust. Because certainty, when grounded in dignity, has a way of settling the room without ever raising its voice. Spring returned gradually, and with it came a sense of quiet equilibrium that felt earned rather than imposed. And as the first green shoots appeared along the edge of the lawn, I found myself reflecting not on the clause or the meeting or the careful signatures that had reshaped our direction, but on the simple fact that the house still belonged to the rhythm I had chosen. Daniel visited more often now, without agenda, sometimes bringing fresh bread from the bakery near his office, sometimes arriving with no reason at all except to sit at the kitchen table and talk about work or the markets or the news. The urgency that once hovered beneath his tone had faded, replaced by something steadier, more reflective, as though he had come to understand that control does not equal care and that acceleration is not always wisdom. Vanessa, too, moved differently in my presence. She asked about the rose bushes we had trimmed months earlier, about the fertilizer schedule, about how Edward used to time the planting by the temperature rather than the calendar, and when I shared those details, she listened without redirecting the conversation toward logistics or future arrangements. One evening, as we stood together in the backyard watching the sun lower itself behind the trees, Daniel said quietly that he had not realized how much of his perspective had been shaped by fear. Fear of unpredictability, fear of decline, fear that waiting meant losing ground.
I told him that patience is not the absence of planning, but the discipline of timing, and that some things cannot be rushed without diminishing their value. He did not argue. He simply nodded. And in that nod, I recognized growth that no legal document could force. The protective clause remained in place, not as a weapon, but as architecture, an unseen beam reinforcing the structure, so that no one would mistake generosity for fragility again. I no longer thought about whether it would ever need to be enforced. Its purpose had already been fulfilled, the moment it shifted expectation into respect. As summer approached and the days grew longer, I hosted a small gathering on the patio, neighbors and friends mingling beneath string lights that Daniel helped install along the fence line, and I watched him move through the yard with a quiet pride that was not attached to ownership, but to belonging. Later, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were stacked neatly beside the sink, I stood alone for a moment in the center of the living room and felt a calm certainty settle over me. I had not fought. I had not shouted. I had not needed to defend myself in dramatic fashion. I had simply defined the terms under which my life would continue, and in doing so, I had given Daniel and Vanessa something far more valuable than an early inheritance. I had given them time to understand the difference between entitlement and stewardship. The house remained steady around me, the walls holding decades of memory without trembling, and I realized that the greatest shift had not occurred in the distribution of assets, but in the balance of respect. When you stand firmly within your own boundaries, you do not need to demand acknowledgement. It arrives quietly, shaped by consequence and sustained by clarity. And as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I understood that what I had preserved was not merely property or equity measured in dollars, but the simple, enduring right to decide when and how the next chapter of my life would begin.